welcome to The Aggressive Life. You know, we all have that friend who's just cool as hell, right? Cool job, cool style, cool attitude, cool freaking hair with his own Wikipedia page. We all got our friend that's like that, right? Well, I got this guy as a friend. I shared 3 days with him in very, very close proximity. We've stayed in touch. And that guy, that's Pete Muller. He is an award-winning photographer. He works as a storytelling fellow for National Geographic. He's been all around the world. He's chronicled everything from the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone to the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, conflict zones in Africa and the Middle East. And he had a documentary on the early days of COVID in New York City called The First Wave, and it was shortlisted for an Academy Award. And he has been studying and documenting modern forms of masculinity. Fascinating guy. And he came to Man Camp, a thing that I run with some other dudes. It's had about 20,000 guys go through it. He came to it last year, and it was awesome, just awesome spending time with him. I thought, man, so much of what makes a good podcast, just having a good conversation with somebody who you like, you love being around. And so, welcome to The Aggressive Life, Pete Muller.
Thanks a lot, Brian. It's nice to see you, as they say in this age.
Yeah, no kidding. Like, I'm thinking to myself, man, this is how fast life has gone. We had an amazing 3 days or so together, chit-chatted here and there over the last year, and I thought, man, that's pretty sad that I've got to have a podcast just to talk to my old buddy now. How are things?
They're going well. They're going well. It's amazing to think that almost a year has passed since we were together in Ohio last year. Wild.
Right. That is crazy. I didn't know about the documentary that was shortlisted for an Academy Award. Talk about that.
I was fortunate to be asked by this really, really terrific director, Matthew Heineman, and a team that he'd assembled to come on and help him co-produce this film about the chaos that was unfolding in New York City in the early days of the pandemic. From sort of the ostensible period of the film is from March to June of 2020. And I came on to help him. As you know, I'd previously covered the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014 and 15. So I had some degree of experience of covering these types of things. And Matt asked me on to help him put this film together. And we ended up working on it for, all in the filming and the post-production, all that stuff was about 18 months or so. We put it out last November, and the response has been really good, positive. I think it's a really important film.
So where can I see it?
So it's a National Geographic film, so you can watch it on Disney Plus. You can watch it on Hulu, those platforms. And it was just nominated for 7 Emmy Awards this round. So we're
wow.
We'll see what that turns up in terms of recognition.
The First Wave. All right. I know it's going to be on my thing. That's good. Now, you mentioned National Geographic. Are you on staff with National Geographic? Are you on retainer? Or, what's that look like?
No, so my National Geographic at this stage has very few staff photographers. I actually think there are only 2 photographers that are technically still on the staff there. We're all freelancers of sort of varying forms of engagement or commitment with National Geographic. I've been over the last couple of years, I've been really fortunate to be what's called a storytelling fellow. So that's a more involved level of commitment with them. I'm working on longer projects. I sort of do a little bit more direct involvement with them as a result. But I do all kinds of things with Nat Geo. It's one of the cool things about it as a photographer is it offers all kinds of different ways that you can be involved in terms of commercial projects, speaking engagements, grant funding, magazine assignments and stuff like that. So it's a wonderful place to have that level of connection.
How did you get interested in photography, and when did you discover this was going to be your life?
I grew up around it. My mother was a newspaper photographer. My father's father had been a commercial photographer. He was a Swedish immigrant. So photography was around me a lot. And the visual arts were around me a tremendous amount. My father was a paintings restorer. He was a conservator at the Princeton University Art Museum, where he stewarded their collection, did all the technical restoration on the paintings and the sculptures and stuff for like 40 years. And so the role of visual depictions of the world was very present in my life growing up, but I didn't necessarily want to be part of it. My family was kind of, they had their problems. Every family's got their problems, but I sort of felt that I kind of wanted to reject what I understood as, in fact, problems that afflict all kinds of people. I just saw them in the manifestation of like artists and people who are involved in the visual arts. And so I had an aversion to it, frankly. But ultimately, as I went on, I went to university. I was studying peace and conflict studies. I was really interested in sort of the contemporary historic origins of modern conflicts. Why were these conflicts unfolding in various places? I wanted to understand that much better. And photography and sort of journalism more broadly provided me an opportunity to be able to like really study those things in a way that felt good to me, which was to be up close.
But you have a very eclectic background, right? I mean, you grew up in a kind of blue collar, old school Boston neighborhood, right?
Well, actually, no, not necessarily. It's interesting. My mother, as I said, was a newspaper photographer, so she didn't make much money, and the type of work that my father did also is not a particularly lucrative type of work. But my mother moved us from the southern part of New Jersey on this barrier island to a town called Marblehead, Massachusetts, which was next to the city where my father grew up, which is Lynn, Massachusetts. And that town is well-to-do. It's been gentrified a lot over the last 45 or 50 years. It used to be a boat building, fishing town. And then it was sort of discovered by people mostly in the finance community in Boston, wanted to live on the ocean. And they started buying up a lot of property there. But when we moved there, the town was sort of bifurcated in a sense. That there were people who had a lot of money, and then there was a lot of other people who didn't, and it sort of seemed that we were somewhat relegated. And I can't entirely tell. It's something I've been thinking through. To what extent did I participate in that relegation, or was that actually something that was really prominent on the landscape, or did it loom larger in my mind than I thought it did?
Yeah, you were telling me that the buddies you grew up with are not the kind of folks who would go out and purchase National Geographic. You've got actually a bifurcation in your masculine journey in terms of people you spent time with, right?
Definitely. I mean, when I was coming up, my father wasn't around when I was coming up. It wasn't that he wasn't involved in our lives at all, but he was sort of sparingly present. So I did a lot of seeking of sort of masculine guidance, both from friends, but also from older guys. And certainly all of the older guys that I gravitated towards were serious blue collar guys, and that's the kind of work that I did. Of course, in the summertime, I played football and sports and things. And then in the summertime, we did construction work and that type of stuff. And those guys ended up really being strong mentors for me in terms of my sense of, I don't know, how I was supposed to behave as a man, or what my outlooks or value systems ought to be.
So Pete, for our listeners, Pete contacted me, folks who work with me, about a year and a half ago, a while ago, saying he was doing a study with National Geographic on masculinity. He wanted to come to Man Camp. Could he come? Of course he can. He came, brought a whole bunch of camera gear, was just like, clicking shots all over the place. It was really fascinating for me to see this Man Camp through his eyes. We got to camp together, hang around a campfire for 3 nights and stuff like that. It was really, really interesting, just getting to know him. I want to get in a moment about some of your impressions of Man Camp, but before we get into that, just tell me, where did the project go? What was the heart behind your Masculinity in America project? What did you learn, or what have you learned? Just fill us in on the vision of that.
Well, so I've been working, Brian, on issues related to sort of men and behavior and male experiences for a number of years, probably almost, I guess, about 10 years. And what I'd been doing in the past is I would do these types of case studies. So I did a lengthy, 2-year study of men in the warscape of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, because I was based in East and Central Africa for over a decade. And I was really interested. There was, a tremendous amount of violence that was unfolding almost universally at the hands of men, of soldiers, and different armed male participants in the armed landscape in the war. And I became really curious about what ultimately was happening with these guys that was yielding this level of really egregious violence. So, I became really almost kind of obsessed with the ideas of trying to understand, particularly soldiers, because soldiers were the ones that were committing most of the abuses. So I spent, really a good amount of time. I was afforded a grant from what's called the Open Society Foundation of Southern Africa to be able to do this work. I was spending a lot of time with really low-level infantry soldiers in combat, out of combat, doing these lengthy interviews, trying to better understand the circumstances that were giving rise to this kind of violence. It was an extraordinary experience. I mean, my background is not really in photography. My background, as I said, is in sort of conflict studies and conflict analysis. So what was fascinating to look at was the ways in which these soldiers, who had mostly been incorporated into the army — you have a lot of different rebel groups in a place like Eastern Congo. And one of the strategies for trying to create stabilities, so to speak, in Eastern Congo is to integrate all of these different rebel groups, which ultimately means that, you're sort of plying them with the government will say, okay, you can come in, your commanding officer will have a high rank, you guys get new uniforms, you get a few perks, but ultimately those soldiers are often not professionalized. And then the structures within the army are really, really substandard. Payments, leave time, therapy, trauma treatment, all that stuff is virtually non-existent. So you're essentially dealing with a male population that's been either conscripted into the army or brought into the army in various ways, extremely brutalized at a psychological level. They've been inculcated with a really strong sense of sort of, aggressive masculinity, which in the atmosphere of that level of deprivation and trauma has really, really devastating impacts in terms of the use of violence. So I studied that for a number of years. And then I did a longer study for National Geographic magazine about boyhood around the world. How were boys sort of being raised in various parts of the world? What were the sort of lessons that they were learning? What was common among them? What was different? And that was a large story that we published in early 2018, I think, National Geographic magazine. And now I'm continuing on with that in the American landscape. Coming out to Man Camp was sort of the early parts of my seeking various types of things that were happening in a concentrated way of men engaging with other men about conversations about where we're at, how we're feeling, what we're doing, what's working, what's not working. And from that, I've sort of, I've been doing a lot since I was with you guys there, including really starting a film project, which is what I'm really working on now.
So what are you learning and concluding? Are there any conclusions that you're having right now as far as the state of masculinity and men in America, or the jury's still out? Like, let's just give us some stuff here. What's going on? Because things don't look very good from my perspective.
Right. Well, I think, a lot of this, Brian, for me is really personal. As I said, I was hit with like a really heavy dose of this type of aggressive masculine posturing when I was coming up, and all I really cared about was being tough, being strong, being big, being sort of dominant, I guess. But in ways that certainly when I think back on it were really supposedly about the right things, I thought, which was standing up for, I got into a lot of physical fights and stuff. And I'd like to think that most of that was motivated by an interest that I felt that I tied certainly to my sense of masculinity, of being willing to step in and protect other people that I didn't feel were necessarily as capable or as willing to stand up for themselves. But it certainly had I was really brought into what I felt was a very aggressive space. And the truth of the matter is that I was struggling with a lot of stuff emotionally that I felt I had no language for. We learn a lot of things as boys and men, but not among those things, at least in my experience, was any clear, strong sense of like emotional expression or emotional literacy, being able to really talk openly and freely about how you were feeling. It all just sort of got pushed out, at least in my case. And I think it's the case for a fair number of people. At a certain point in my life, it was all getting pushed out as anger. And in truth, it wasn't anger. I suppose some of it was anger, but for the most part, it was a feeling of, I don't know, insecurity, dejection, feeling unsure, feeling to some degree like kind of unwanted by my folks and stuff. There was a lot of emotional stuff that was happening with me, and I did not have outlets or language for that stuff.
So you were that way, and now you are a different way, or you were in the middle somewhere? Where do you see that now? Because I don't see any. The time I spent with you, I don't see any unhealthy forms of aggression within you. I don't see any of that.
No, well, I think this is really the product of a lot of work that I felt that I've done really over probably the last I'd say 20 years of my life, but most concertedly over the last 10 to 15 years of really trying to think through, what feels good to me? How can I kind of be in a sort of better sense of, I don't know, of balance with myself and being able to communicate in ways that feel, I don't know, accurately expressive of the way that I feel like I'm experiencing the world. So I continue to do therapy these days. I try to participate in as many constructive things. I read an awful lot. I take a lot of therapeutic value of being like with you guys last year. I try to be in as many atmospheres as I can and learn from the people that I communicate with. These projects are I hope can be something that can help our understanding of things, but I'd be lying if I said that they aren't very personal to me, in the sense that I derive a lot of satisfaction and a lot of, I don't know, something very helpful from being with other men and talking with other men about how they are navigating the world.
I mean, it seems like you're drawing some heavy stuff. Ebola outbreak, that's pretty heavy. Humanitarian crises in Sudan, conflict zones in Africa, the Middle East. I mean, that's some pretty heavy stuff. Are you drawn to that stuff because it's what makes good photos? It's what people want to hear about? Or just you personally, you're drawn to those conflict, difficult things?
I think it's probably some of both. I think I felt a lot of conflict in my upbringing, in my family. And I think that really began to be the germinating factor in my interest in conflicts outside of myself. So I think I do bring that, at least in terms of the sort of energy that I have for it. But And I think to some degree I've intellectualized some of that emotional experience and pursued it as these sort of investigations as to how do people's senses of being wronged, of facing injustice, of going through things that are really unacceptable as a group of people, being dominated by somebody that for reasons that don't feel fair, and how do those things ultimately motivate people to move into the realm of violence and armed conflict? So I think photographically, it's something that it's one of the reasons why I'm grateful to have moved away from some of that, because I think what's interesting to me about conflict photography, in a sense, is that people think it's really hard, and of course it is hard because you could be killed, any number of bad things could happen. But ultimately, it's a landscape, it's a situation that's really thriving in super high drama, right? Everywhere you turn, there are extremely dramatic things that are happening. People are being killed. People are being displaced. People are living in very desperate circumstances. And the photographic medium, the photojournalistic medium, often really thrives under those kinds of circumstances. But I think there's a huge amount of much deeper reasoning for why those situations arise, and I'm grateful at this stage to be kind of moving into the quieter spaces. It's much more challenging, to try to make compelling imagery in quieter, more familiar places. But I think that what I'm grappling with are things that are sort of universal, and if I can meet the challenge of using the sort of communication techniques that I have, audio, film, photography, I think we can create some really important stuff that helps us understand things better.
So you show up at Man Camp. Mm-hmm. Not sure exactly what you were expecting initially. We had a good time with Pete. I remember this one. He came in and said, "Hey, look, I think we never let outside people come in. It's what happens at Man Camp stays at Man Camp, is what we say. We don't bring in outside video crews or anything like that. We have some people who take video and photos internally for next year's promotion purposes, but just haven't done a lot of that at all." Pete comes in and he comes in a day early when all the lead team is there, and kind of we're staying up late, drinking the night before, sitting around a campfire and just kind of he's getting the lay of the land, all that stuff. And he said, "Hey, okay, so I'm going to come up. I'm I want to talk to some people, but we just need to tell people just need to look at me and tell me, hey, F off, F off, Pete. We said, okay, we'll tell them that. So the first session, big, huge tent, 512, Jug goes, okay, we got a guy from here from National Geographic. Pete, he says, if you don't want to talk to him, you can just tell him to F off. I'm saying the short one, Dirk, because I don't want to get edited out of what's the standards here about editing and how this podcast gets out?
Yeah, you should probably just edit yourself.
I'll just edit myself? Yeah. Okay. So he said this, so why don't we all just practice right now? Let's just tell Pete to F off. The whole group, F off, Pete! It broke the ice, and then of course it was our way. Actually, I told you were uncomfortable with that. I said no, it'll loosen these dudes up, and then you'll be able to talk to anybody at any time. And so you basically had unfettered access. We're around talking with dudes. Tell us, what did you learn about the average guy who chooses to attend a man camp event? And is the guy who attends a man camp event, in your knowledge with this project, is the average guy who comes to a man camp event the average guy in America, not the average guy in America?
I mean, it's part of the reason why I wanted to come to Man Camp, and what I think is part of what's so interesting about what you're doing, Brian, is that I think you're reaching a group of people that is pretty often like excluded from this type of conversation. You know, I think we both know that there are a fair amount of conversations that are unfolding these days about men and ideas of masculinity and all these ideas of toxicity and all this stuff. And I think certainly in kind of a like an urban sort of different political type of group, I think there's more discussion about this. But, you know, certainly with a lot of the guys that I grew up with, this, you know, who are more vocational and blue collar guys, this just still is not something that's particularly like dominant in discussion. And I think you have done such an interesting job of, you know, through your role at Crossroads and the audience that you have of that, bringing men together for, you know, for the ostensible purpose of, okay, this is going to be a worship event. But when you, in the context of that, which draws so many guys, and as you've said, and as you've by design created Man Camp as this opportunity for guys to come and have a religious experience outside the confines of the walls of the church, which, you know, you explained to me is commonly not a space where men in particular feel, you know, particularly comfortable, or not all men, certainly men that prefer to be outside, men that like to work with their hands. It's not always for them a suitable type of environment. So you've created this incredible kind of atmosphere where you're inviting in a group of men that I think is extremely important, and I think it's a group that is, to some degree, in my opinion, is somewhat excluded from some of these conversations that you are doing, you know, such a great job of facilitating. Let's not just talk about you know, the ostensible reasons why we're here, all the stuff that draws people, you know, like we'll get out, we're going to chop wood, we're going to clear land, we're going to camp, we're going to play games. But in the mix of all of that is this really important conversation that you're attempting to have about how men are doing and how we can sort of be there for one another and better understand one another and create more constructive, you know, pathways through some of the challenges that men face.
And as you looked at that, your kind of your observations actually were a bit helpful when you came. You did it again. You called it a worship event. I would never call Man Camp a worship event. There's certainly a good bit of worship there, but I think what you're saying, for me, that's just a small piece of it. But for you, and this is the vernacular you use that I shunned initially, but then the more I've thought about it, like, you said it was a revival. You said you basically have a revival going on here. And I was like, a revival? Like, that's, I don't know, that's probably more accurate than I would have thought that it was before. Why do you, worship is just such a very small portion of the time period, given all the other stuff's there, but you tend to draw towards those parts of the experiences. Those things seem to be the things that capture your imagination or seem to be the strongest for you, or what is it about you? Because you're not unless something's happened in the last year, you're not would you call yourself a follower of Christ?
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I was raised with a sort of, I guess almost what I describe as a kind of schizophrenic relationship with religion, in the sense that my mother would go through these like fits of saying, you know, we've got to get you guys to church. And then we'd go for a couple of years. And there was a while where I was fairly sort of into it as a teenager, but I wouldn't describe myself that way. And in fact, you know, about the terminology, I had asked a number of the guys on your team, like the organizers, I said, what would you call this? Because as someone that doesn't come from that culture, culture, to me, I hear the word revival and it sort of seems like what I imagine a revival might be. And I guess, some of them said, well, you could sort of technically perhaps I'll call it that. I chose worship event because I still don't quite know how to describe it because it's really multifaceted. I mean, it's something really, I think it's a really unique ecosystem that you've built there. And like you said, the worship is, it's part of every day, but it's not necessarily the dominant way in which people are spending their time. Although I was just incredibly moved by what I saw in the prayer tent. The big tent events where you're on stage and the band is playing and all that stuff. That's powerful in its own way, but there was something incredibly moving about the intimacy of the connections and the way that people were engaging with each other inside of the prayer tent. I mean, I've almost never seen anything quite like it.
Well, why don't you describe what that is to people who are listening? Because I'm curious how you would describe it. It's not like, hey, if you want to come in here and just hold somebody else's hand and pray, go ahead and do that. There's a structure to it. So talk about that.
Well, you correct me where I'm wrong. I mean, I only have what I recall from my observations, but you have a team inside that's sort of there as the designated people who are there to pray with men and hear men out and sit and engage with them. And I guess it seems to vary. Is it typically two men that receive somebody, or
it's generally two at a time.
Right. And I saw some instances where there were more than that. Some really intense instances where other men were coming over and supporting this process. And what it seemed to be to me, and I was really trying to be mindful also of people's privacy and things as these conversations were underway. I only took photographs in there. I didn't do any audio recording. But men in the throes of some of the most moving visual emotional breakdowns that I'd seen men undergoing, particularly in a collective circumstance like that, where you've got lots of guys together and men are, collapsing and crying and holding one another, in these really, really sort of powerful exchanges. And I was able to speak to some as they were leaving. I may have taken a couple of photographs and then approached those people afterwards and talked to some of them afterwards. And I was able to do that on a number of occasions. And it was amazing to hear, what people were describing as to what went on inside and how they reached that point of that emotional break. Because I think it's something that just still, despite some of the efforts that we've made to try to encourage men to be more open, I still think there are so few places where men are really able to be that kind of vulnerable with one another and know that it's not going to, there's not going to be rebuke and no one's going to, put anybody down. It's just firmly a sort of structure of emotional support.
Yeah, well, there certainly is that. I don't think that there's really much emotional support for anybody in America, let alone men. I mean, women, I think, can emotionally support one another without getting a level of criticism. But as soon as men start, supporting one another, we just had a guest on. He was talking about this, about how even our vernacular with men, if two guys are going to go out and hang out as friends, they're on a mandate. No, they're hanging out as friends. If another guy seems infatuated with another guy, really intrigued by him, and likewise, then it's a bromance. We have these terms almost like we're trying to diffuse the awkward nature of guys being friends, and so therefore, guys aren't being friends because it's just seen as weird, and dudes are hurting, and when they come to a place where it's okay to be not okay, there's some powerful things that can happen. I think that's part of what happens in that prayer tent.
I agree. And it seems to be so statistically substantiated these days that men are really struggling. We see that in suicide rates. We see that in alcohol abuse. We see that in opioid deaths. We see that in the people that participate in surveys that talk about the level of friendships that they have. I mean, there's a staggering number of men, I think over the age of 40, that report actually having no friends, nobody to turn to when they've got problems. And, I think that all of these things are interrelated. As you said, there's a lot of loneliness and isolation in America right now across the sex line. But, I think to some degree, being able to form, I think men are, some of what I hear women lament at times is this sort of burden of all this emotional labor that they're often kind of is foisted upon them by the men that they're with, and having to sort of listen through all of what this guy is going through, because there's not really room to share any of that. Where is he allocating? Is there some portion of this that he could potentially allocate to a different part of his support network, other friends, people, other men that could share some of that?
Oh, you're saying when a guy's dating a woman, she's his lifeline or wife, everything line, because I got nobody else to support me emotionally. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that seems commonly taught, that's commonly discussed, that we sort of, as men, as heterosexual men, are relying on our female partners to sort of carry us through all of the tribulations and, emotional tumult and stuff that we go through, because my contention is that we just don't have sufficient enough relationships with other men to be able to vent at least part of that burden.
Yeah, boy, that's interesting. I did not know that women were noticing that and articulating that. That makes a lot of sense. Which, shout out to the women folk who are with us right now. If you've got a guy and he's spending a lot of time and a lot of money on experiences with friends, it can be tough, I know, but before you criticize it or try to lessen it, just recognize if a guy has another guy that he's spending time and money with, that is a safety net for you. And I speak with women all the time who feel threatened and vulnerable because their man doesn't have anybody. They just feel exposed. And I don't think that they would say this. They never put two and two together and say, I am more threatened and I am fragile and I am at risk because my husband doesn't have her. They never say that. They never say that clearly, diagnose it that clearly. But that's basically what they're saying. That's what they're feeling, because that's the way it is. It's tough.
Well, you're so well positioned. It's why I'm interested in your perspectives, Brian, for a number of reasons. But one of which is that you are essentially, in your role, you are a confidant for people. A lot of people, some people turn to therapists, some people have friendship networks and stuff. But I think you, in your role, you hear an awful lot of what's happening in the inner lives of people. So I think you're well positioned to sort of make determinations about what's happening and to hear that somewhat reinforced, perhaps not in the same language. And I don't mean to impose anything on anybody. These are just things that I've observed in my own discussions with people, that women at times really do feel that they're carrying a tremendous amount of burden in the emotional sphere by having to field just about everything that the men that they're involved with are going through, if he doesn't have another support system.
So is what you saw at Man Camp a microcosm of the macro project that you are working on, or was what took place at Man Camp? I'm not talking about the events and all that stuff. We could talk about that if we want, but just like the general state of the guy there, or what took place there, is that representative of the larger body of your work, or is it an outlier?
I don't know. I don't think it's an outlier necessarily, but I don't know. I guess it's in part because my work is kind of informed, arguably maybe too much so, by I really liked university. There's always been part of me that thinks, well, I should really, I'm a photographer or a filmmaker or whatever, but really the way that I pursue things is almost in an academic way. And so to me, yeah, over time, when you hang around in lots of places and you talk to lots of people about the same things, you begin to notice commonalities. And I do think that there are baseline issues that really unify experiences across worlds and communities and language communities and all that stuff. But I try to treat most things as a sort of independent ecosystem. And I think Man Camp was that way. I think it's representative of a lot of different dynamics, but I try not to extrapolate too much, certainly until I feel like I've really got my bearings. And to me, working back in the United States, I'm obviously from here, but I was away for a very long time. The majority of my adult life, up until about 2.5 years ago, was spent overseas. And so I'm still really cautious of any conclusions that I'm drawing about the things that I'm seeing.
Well, what about surprises when you were at Man Camp? Things that you're like, didn't expect that, that's interesting.
I did not expect that prayer tent, and I did not expect the energy in that tent. It was just, as I said, I have sort of a back and forth relationship with religion, and it was inconsistently involved enough in my life that it's there in some ways and absent in others. but I've always found there to be something almost gravitational about religious experiences that people are having. I mean, almost every time when I was assigned to take photographs in any place, particularly in Africa, but almost anywhere, I mean, one of the first stops I would make is whatever sort of religious institution was there. Churches, mosques, any place where people were coming together to pray, because ultimately we are fundamentally social creatures. We have a deep, deep abiding need to be with one another and to communicate with one another. I mean, I think it's how we experience, not just culturally and emotionally, but neurobiologically, we need one another to sort of alleviate the sort of stresses and the things that we contend with. There's something so important. And what was occurring in that prayer tent, I thought was one of the most sort of exceptional and intense versions of that type of communion that I'd seen almost anywhere. I mean, I was incredibly moved by it. And I think that the photographs really show that. There was one image that I made there of a young guy who I was able to speak with afterwards. And, he was in the midst of a pretty emotional moment, and he was surrounded by other men, and they were touching him. They had their hands on him, and he was, really breaking. And it was incredible. I mean, it was just an incredible scene. And I think the photographs reflect some of that energy.
So when you see that kind of movement of the spirit in that tent, you feel that kind of movement of the spirit in the tent, what keeps you from stepping over the line to saying, I want more of that in my own personal life forever?
Yeah. I mean, I think it does, to me, I guess I have a kind of agnostic view in some ways of anything that helps people, and I think to some degree, I sort of pick and choose the things that I'm learning help me. So, there are elements of something that I could experience at Man Camp that are alluring, that felt really good and restorative, but I don't necessarily feel like committed in my life in any particular way to a certain type of like school of thought or ideology or practice. I kind of just draw from whatever seems to be working for me. So I pick and choose elements of things, and I have nothing but respect and affirmation for people who find solace and comfort and guidance in whatever they, wherever they derive it from, so long as it's not destructive to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. You seemed visibly touched by that when we were together. I almost felt like you couldn't step over the line of faith because you had your journalistic integrity to hold to, and you can't, which I totally respect. It's like, wait a minute, I didn't come here to have a, I don't know, transformation moment or whatever moment. Came here to do my job, which is great. I felt like there was that, maybe appropriate barrier up, because that's what brought you there, was the job. And I just wasn't sure, like in the years since then, as you've gone on your journey, if there's been anything more that's been, I don't know, insightful or helpful for you.
Well, it was, I suppose it's interesting to how we might think about like something being transformative, because it was a transformative experience for me. I mean, I'll never forget that experience. But I have to say that, to varying degrees, but I feel relatively transformed, I think, because of the degree to which I care about this. I mean, I really, really care about this. And my care is centers in me, because, I really want to try to be the sort of best and healthiest and most productive and considerate version of the man that I am. But I also think that there's incredible significance at a social level for us better understanding these issues. And so when I come at these stories, or whatever you want to call them, experiences, I suppose is better or feels more accurate to me, I'm pretty immensely transformed by most of what I'm able to do, in part because people are, I think to some degree people can sense in me that how much I'm concerned with it and how much I'm seeking. I'm really seeking a lot. And I think that people have, in response to that energy, been incredibly generous with themselves, and allowed me insights and opportunities to be with them and better understand things about them. And as I understand other people better, I think I begin to understand aspects of myself better.
Well, you definitely have a great knack of being personable, likable, empathetic. I mean, you're a pretty impressive dude. You just you're very emotionally and relationally intelligent. So
Thanks,
it's easy for people to want to do that for you because you just, man, you got the interaction gene. You got an amazingly high EQ, IQ, RQ, the whole thing. It's really good.
Thanks. I feel really, it's been one of the things that's enriched my life the most, really, has been that, that I've been able to meet, I'm inclined to meet, and I've been able to meet so many interesting people who've been so generous with me, really.
Man Camp, hey, I tell you what, I would be really, really remiss if I didn't just take some time out right now to say to all of the masculine types here in this podcast, if you've been to Man Camp, you need to freaking go. I'm telling you right now, just go. Stop thinking about it. Stop researching about it. 40 different states have signed up so far for the Man Camp. That's October 21st to 23rd. Have fun, smile, laugh, push yourself, meet some new dudes, have perhaps some transcendent spiritual experiences that might happen for you. Friends, I got to tell you, man, I want to see you there. It's one of the most important weekends of your life. It may be the most defining and important weekend of your life. Push yourself, get out there, go to mancamp.us. Registrations close 9:15 midnight on September 15th. Can't wait to see you there. You will thank me. Get there. Stop procrastinating. Chop, chop. So are there other commonalities that you're finding as the project has gone forward? Can you give us any things of, hey, men are like this in the world, or is it not true that men in America are doing the same things that men in wherever are? Or is America a microcosm of what's happening all over the globe? Or what? Is this masculine crisis, whatever it is it everywhere, or is it just in America?
Well, here's something that I'll say with some reservation, but I think it's something that I do believe. I think that the way that we define and reinforce notions of masculinity seem to really correspond with hardship in a lot of cases. And beyond hardship, I'd say scarcity, where you find significant amounts of scarcity, be it resource-based or economic or both. Usually those things are conjoined, where things are really scarce, where people have either a real or imagined sense that there's not enough to go around. You see a pretty widespread reinforcement of very aggressive notions of masculinity, because it's just the fundamental feeling that there's not enough. It's going to be best for whatever in-group, whichever group of people says, okay, generally speaking, if our men are bigger, stronger, tougher than the men over there, because it just tends to be how fights go down, is that men fight other men, then we will be the beneficiaries of those limited resources. And so when things are really scarce, you start to see much, much more rigid, tougher notions of masculinity. And I think that where, if you kind of look around at places where we see much more, so-called progressive notions of masculinity, where we're seeing a kind of, I don't know, the words for this stuff still kind of elude me, like a more sort of softening, emotionally aware type of masculinity. Generally speaking, those things tend to transpire in places where people are pretty comfortable, and they don't necessarily have to fight day to day to get what they need.
I.e. America.
Well, no, I think America is incredibly, I think the level of wealth disparity and the experiences that people are having in the United States are so staggering, where some people have more than, any group of people have ever had in human civilization, and other people are living in profound destitution.
Yes, but, when I hear people talk about are men even needed anymore, the idea of toxic masculinity, those always tend to be higher brow folks in higher income brackets. People aren't saying that and asking those questions in blue collar communities. You talk about the university. It's the university crowd that believes we can just evolve to higher levels of consciousness, and we don't need all those extra muscles.
Right.
Right.
Right. Well, and I would say that I think that that's in line with part of what I'm describing, is that the more insulated people are,
yes,
the more comfortable they are, the more that they have, and the less that they have to really contend with at a very basic level in terms of getting what they need. You're much freer in that respect. You don't have to go out and fight. You don't have to be, fearful and or prepared to confront somebody who might really cause you harm or intend to cause you harm, over something that there simply isn't enough of. So I think what you're saying and what I'm saying is similar in some ways.
Well, the truth of the matter is, us as men, we generally, when I say generally, I'm talking about 95% of the time, our skeletal structure is larger. We have more muscle mass. We have more body mass. We can move things greater, bigger, all that stuff more consistently. That works really, really well in times of war, which is what you're talking about. It also works really, really well in times of transmission factories, in times of building homes, in times of plowing fields, in times of just using your body. And the average guy today doesn't use his body at all. He uses his body at the gym to try to make himself look half decent, in clothes. But I think that's probably part of our problem is we're wired to be more physical than we are right now, and we're out of sync with our physical nature. I think it's a bummer. I think it's a bad thing when every home project, we don't know how to do it, and we're not sure we have the stamina to do it, so we have to pay somebody to do it. Nothing's anything wrong with paying somebody. I just think it's another thing in the male psyche that makes us feel like we're fish out of water. And maybe generations from now we'll evolve to where it won't be a big of a deal. But I think, Pete, right now at this generation, the lack of physicality that the average guy has is a problem. And that's part of what's being born in the statistics. What do you think?
Well, I think that you're right in a lot of ways. I mean, this is stuff that's not really my expertise in terms of, I think, like you say,
it's a podcast. Who cares if your expertise or not? Come on, it's a podcast. Come on, you're being too measured. Your Harvard faculty friends aren't going to listen to this and fact check you. Just come on, dude. We're a couple brothers with having a podcast.
Right. I mean, I guess no, you're right. I mean, I take it. I'm very cautious in the kinds of things that I want to say, because what I think, and it's not, I don't mean to not answer your question, but I think part of the deeper part of what you're saying, pointing out these physical differences and our inclinations in terms of physical activity and how that's advantageous or whatever, is that I think we're at a really, really fascinating time in social history. There's been so much transformation of things that are happening now, so far fewer things, there will always be a need to build houses. I don't think, so far as I can tell, unless we're going to 3D print houses, there'll always be a need for physicality and vocational work to some degree. But we're seeing such a massive social economic transformation that so much of the things that we relied on, both as releases or means of subsistence or whatever, these things are all changing. And there was so much social ideology, meaning how men considered themselves, how they measured their value. And there were corresponding factors of this with women. We've had all of these amazing kind of gendered identities that were predicated on the circumstances of old. And now those things are changing in remarkable ways. And I think we're sitting at like a really fascinating, exciting, interesting time where we are alive and contributing to what the new definitions of these things are going to mean. And so when I'm doing this stuff, because I kind of am taking it as seriously as I am, I just always want to try to make sure that I'm really thinking through what I'm observing and how I'm communicating about it. Because I also feel like there's something, we all need each other. We need each other, all of us, all these different facets of our societies, men and women and blue collar people and white collar. We all need each other. And so we've got to understand one another in constructive ways. And so my caution in what I say is not necessarily because I have concerns about, who's watching or thinking, but because I want to try to relay what I'm observing in ways that feel constructive, because this is a really, really exciting and important time. And I want to try to relay whatever I'm thinking in ways that feel thought-provoking and engaging and not alienating or something,
Well, I'm not trying to get anybody alienated. I'm just trying to get from you and pull from you what you're actually seeing without having it being peer reviewed by Harvard yet. Come on, man. What are you seeing out there? I'm telling you, I'm seeing that I think a guy's lack of physicality is affecting us. There's pockets of masculinity and pockets of culture that I think are outside of the nuclear winter that's sweeping society, and those ones are great. We need to learn from them. I'm just thinking, just down the pipe, average guy who, isn't doing social media, is never going to get a book deal, doesn't have a PhD because the average guys don't have PhDs, isn't concerned about what the mass everything says about this or that, doesn't measure his words. He's just trying to get through the day, the week, the month, the year, his life. And man, those dudes are not well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And like we said before, there's a lot of really scary statistic about those guys. And I think you're really front and center, Brian, I think in that discussion. And, it's why I really wanted to, we had some engagement not so long ago where I would really like to see your voice involved in more of these types of discussions, because I think you've got a lot to offer in that way.
Pete, are you ready for the lightning round? This round ends our time together. It's when I give you a sentence and you answer it real quick, like in a lightning fashion, like quickly, bam. Can you do it? Are you up for the lightning round?
Sure.
All right, here we go. The most aggressive move Pete Muller's making right now.
I think this is going to sound kind of tongue in cheek, but I feel like I'm being extremely aggressive in terms of trying to better understand myself.
Good. Yeah, this is a beautiful lightning round. You don't have to expand upon it unless I ask you. So there you go. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Biggest aggressive mistake you can remember making and what you learned from it.
I think that it's sort of almost related to the first question. I think that a considerable part of the mistake that I made in my life was having an outlook that sort of refused to engage with the things that were really and truly troubling me. And that created, I think, an awful lot of wasted time. I thought being a certain way would just sort of allow me to get to a place where I wouldn't be concerned with those deep-seated issues any longer. And I think that was a real mistake that I continue to have to try to unravel.
Most common thing that we're doing wrong when we take photos on our iPhone?
Being inattentive. People are just so cavalier. We all are with pictures now. It's just snap, snap, snap. If people just took just a moment and kind of thought through a little bit of why are you actually raising the camera right now, and how can you utilize this as like a tool to best preserve what is motivating you to take the picture in the first place.
Interesting. Okay, I think you got some gold to mine there. So dig into that more. Like, intentional thought. We were saying I raise the camera. What am I doing? I'm asking, why am I taking this picture? What's the interesting thing in this picture? What do you mean? Just talk more about that.
Like, so for example, I don't know, just make like an example. You see something happening with like one of your children, for instance. Something great is happening with him or her, and you're motivated to raise the camera because you see that thing happening, but people don't think through the fact that like you're seeing from your vantage point, you're able to look through the shoulders of the people who are standing in front of you, and you're able to see her expression or whatever it is. But as a photograph, you're going to want to move yourself into like a slightly better position so that the camera can actually record what it was that motivated you to take it out of your pocket in the first place. Because people just kind of, people say, oh, look at this wonderful picture of my daughter doing this or that. And really it's a picture of the person standing in front of you's back. Just momentary little pauses. I mean, we would do wise to pause on a lot of things that we're doing these days and just think for a moment before we act. But I think photography is one of them.
All right, last part of the lightning round. Area of the world or topic that you would like to explore through photography.
I don't know. These days, I'm just feeling really committed to America. I'm so glad to be back.
America.
I think we're at a really, really, I think we're at a really important time. I think there's a lot of critical stuff that's going on right now. And I'm really grateful also to be expanding beyond photography. I mean, photography was the mainstay of what I did, since I was about 25, I guess. I turned 40 this year. And it's really exciting to me to to be working now more in film and broadening what I'm able to do, because I think, photography, I love photography and I always will. And I think there's a really special power about photography. I think it affords something really considered, because it's frozen. You have to imagine so much else. What did it sound like? What happened before? What happened afterwards? There's something really powerful about that. But I'm really, really grateful to be working my way out into these other media that can more comprehensively tell stories. And I'm here. I'm working a lot up in the upper Northeast and in Maine in particular, and really pouring an awful lot of myself into trying to understand what's happening here.
All right, Pete, if someone wants to follow up with you or see your films or see your photography, just give us an advertisement for yourself.
I use Instagram a fair amount. I have an Instagram handle. It's Pete_K_Muller, Muller. And there you can find my website and links to stuff. But that's primarily the social media that I use. I have a website and stuff, but if you Google my name and photography or whatever, it'll come up.
Shoot, dude, I think I just realized if I've been saying your last name wrong, I think I've been saying Mueller and you're saying it's Muller. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, it happens all the time.
Mueller. Remember that?
Yeah.
Ferris Bueller.
That's right. No, it's all good.
I'll take a mispronunciation and I'll just turn it into a nickname for you. That's how I roll. So
perfect.
All right, man. Hey, thanks for coming on. I love what you're doing. You got some really great measured insights for us. Thank you. I've just enjoyed being with you, and I hope we hang together around the campfire soon. So. That's it. Hey, if you heard Pete say anything that resonates with you, do something. This isn't a podcast about thinking about something only as far as you start doing something. Here's the thing you could do. If a guy from New England who works for National Geographic can come to a thing called Man Camp and have a really, really good time and have a great memory, you can too. Freaking sign up. Get yourself out. Do something physical. Camp somewhere. Chop something. Laugh. Belly laugh. All that stuff you can have at Man Camp and more. We'll put the info here on the podcast. Thank you there, Pete Mueller, also known as Pete Muller. We'll see you next time on The Aggressive Life.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for listening. For all things aggressive living, why don't you head over to briantome.com. Find my new book, Move, a guide to get up and go forward, as well as articles and much, much more. And no matter where you listen to podcasts, why don't you take a second and leave us a rating, leave us a review. It really, really helps us drive new listeners to the show. We want to help as many people as possible, just like we may have helped you. We want to help others. So why don't you help us out? And if you want to connect, find me on Instagram at Brian Tome. The Aggressive Life with Brian Tome is a production of Crossroads Church, Cincinnati, Ohio.